Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Great to see such a good turnout for our event this evening. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. I'll just be brief and then I'll hand over. We have Azadeh Moaveni, the author of this evening's book, which is The Guest House for Young Widows Among the Women of ISIS. Azadeh is an academic, long-term Middle East correspondent. She teaches journalism at NYU in London and is also the senior analyst for gender and conflict at the International Crisis Group. Is that right? Yes. She's also author of the highly acclaimed Lipstick Jihad, and we're really delighted to have her with us this evening. And in conversation with Azadeh, chairing the event this evening, is Razia Iqbal. Razia is one of the main presenters of NewsHour, the flagship current affairs programme on BBC World Service. And she's worked at the BBC for 30 years and has been an arts correspondent for 10 years. Welcome, Razia. And I'll hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Ollie, thank you very much indeed. Just to echo what she said, it's fantastic to see so many people here. And I am particularly pleased to be in conversation with Azadeh, not least because I think this book is gaining so much traction, and she has just been shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize. It's a prize I was a judge on a couple of years ago, so I kind of know exactly what the process is of sifting between books that feel important and those that are written incredibly well, and this is exactly one of those books. It's not only written beautifully, but it feels deeply prescient, not least in the light of events yesterday with the US raid in an attempt to capture Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi resulted in his death, which we will, I'm sure, talk about. Azadeh, let's start, though, with the substance of the book, because the impulse for it for you was the three Bethnal Green girls and the way in which the media in this country and elsewhere focused on what they thought was important. Just talk us through what was going through your mind when you started to see the coverage of these three very young teenage schoolgirls deciding to go off and join the Islamic State group.
Thank you, Razia. I'm so delighted to be here with you, and thank you, Molly, and all of you as well for coming. It was a time that I remember now still very vividly, being, first of all, very shocked as a kind of old-time Middle East hand that the violence of the region had spilled all the way out into Europe, that it was no longer contained in the region, but that it had spread, and that young girls, popular, interesting, academically bright young women from London, born and bred in London, thought that they were implicated in that. The media coverage, and I was living here, of course, at the time. I'd been living in the UK now for 10 years. I was struck by the anger and the contempt that was displayed towards these young girls. On paper they were 15. Sometimes I think one of them was even 14. They had been groomed and recruited by a very predatory network in the classic way that gangs and the exploitative kind of mercenary outfits groom young girls. They had told them that their parents were wrong, that they should come and listen to them, and the kind of grooming cycle as we know it. But the press coverage made them out to be, they were wrong. I remember reading headlines that referred to the whores of ISIS, going to be concubines for the Caliphate. Some of it was quite disturbing, packing industrial-grade lubricant for your journeys. And these were written in the broadsheets by feminist columnists very often. Nowhere was there a sense that these girls were partly victims, that they were not so different from the girls from those northern towns who had been caught up in these terrible grooming gangs, and we understood those girls, very much as victims. So it was hard not to see their race being a part of their excommunication from Britishness, which is how I saw it. I remember there was a particular point after which the police had been searching for them, and it had become a crisis, and their parents had gone on television to appeal to them, come home girls. And there was this one column that said, it's enough, the police and the security services need to stop searching for these girls. It's time to come and concentrate on our girls. And they were just not our girls anymore. And that pierced me because I saw myself in them, how quickly you could go from being a seemingly, second generation, yes, immigrant family, yes, Muslim, other citizen of Britain, to not being British anymore, or not being, a citizen of the Western country you're from. And I was jarred by that, and I wanted to follow them and tell other stories about them.
And the book does that remarkably, I think. You've chosen the stories of 13 girls. 3 of them are the Bethnal Green girls. But one of the things that's interesting is that there was a girl, there were 4 of them, essentially. The first one that goes, and then the 3 that go together. And this idea of being groomed and being targeted is a really interesting one that you explore time and again in the book. And in the context of this country, there's something quite interesting when you talk about the way in which many Muslims in not just this country but all over the world have a sense of grievance against the way in which Western foreign policy has manifest itself in parts of the world where Muslims are targeted or oppressed or in some way not allowed to develop. And I'd like, just before we get into the meat of the conversation, for you just to read a couple of extracts from the thing that ISIS exploits, which is that grey area, as you describe it, of complicity that they feel somehow that Muslims in the West have with their governments, and the way in which they exploit young people who are not educated enough to be able to say, do you know what, I the things that make you not become one of those girls, essentially. So there are 2 sections. So if you can read the 2 sections that I've marked, that we've vaguely talked about, but I just think they're really quite interesting. If you just tell us a little bit about the section that comes before this, about Walthamstow.
Yes, so Walthamstow was an area, there were a few neighborhoods in the country that were quite dense pockets of recruitment for ISIS, and Walthamstow was one of them. And there's a young woman, a character that was from Walthamstow and who had tried to go, and she was blocked from going, and I wrote about her. And I spent a lot of time there trying to understand what is it about Walthamstow that had made it so ripe for this kind of recruitment. So this is the context of why you're hearing about Walthamstow. And I should say there was a very active militant group that I'm sure you've all heard about, Muhajirun, that was a network based there, and there was a very distinct overlap between the Muhajirun network and the ISIS recruitment network. So Walthamstow had a high volume of Muslims, and many sympathized with the core political views that animated groups like Al-Muhajirun. The majority of those sympathizers certainly did not condone violence against civilians, but certain underlying truths were easy to empathize with. The belief that the West, through its war on terror, was waging neo-imperial wars in majority Muslim lands, that with each year the war's geographic scope and brutality, its secret torture sites and drone strikes and targeting of civilians grew more extreme, that through support for Israel and Arab tyrants it enabled Muslim underdevelopment and suffering on a vast scale. There was a gap between agreeing with these truths intellectually and acting on them in a violent fashion. It was a slim, fateful gap that the majority felt condemned to and capable of living within. But for some, the gap felt so slight that it was easy to bridge. It was easy to lure an impressionable young person to the other side. ISIS called that gap the gray zone of complicity and sought to crush it. The tabloids called it creeping Sharia. A prominent neocon thinker called it the strange death of Europe. Walter Benjamin called it the state of emergency that had become, for the oppressed, not the exception but the rule. British Muslims just called it life. This was one of the reasons why it was especially hard for immigrant Muslim parents to spot deviance in their children's behavior. Watching their kids behave more piously made many happy. it meant actually that they could relax a little bit. There was less danger of their children losing their values and straying from their faith. They weren't culturally primed to see more conservative behavior as worrisome. Then here we turn to the opening section, or one of the opening sections, about Sharmina, who was the very first girl. Sharmina was only 15. What did she know of anything? But the logic made sense to her. Extreme violence begat extreme violence. She tried this argument out at school, defending ISIS to a teacher who disagreed sharply with her. They argued, but the teacher reported to neither the school nor Sharmina's father that this vulnerable, testy girl whose mother had just died was openly advocating on behalf of a group that sliced people's heads off on camera. The teacher didn't suggest that perhaps someone might have a talk with her about these radical, violent political views. Perhaps, as might well have happened if she existed in a more educated family and world, someone might have told her that there were other avenues for dissent and other ways to help vulnerable Muslims across the world, that she could devote herself to human rights law and political activism, or post-colonial studies, or conflict reporting, or humanitarian work. There were many things a young woman could do with rage. But it took an attentive, intact family, and living rooms with books, and a sensitive school, and layers of protection that often didn't exist around working-class girls from East London to introduce those ideas. Even when the government got around to employing British Muslim women who had been through precisely this journey, dispatching them to counsel girls who were vulnerable to radicalization, they conceded, as one did in an interview with me, that there was little to no space for these discussions in British society. No avenue for these young, angry women to channel their political discontent to the government.
The really interesting thing about what you outline in those two extracts, for me, is that there is a structure there, right? So the teachers saw something in this particular girl, but they didn't go to her parents, and they didn't go to the security forces, even though the security forces and the police, I think, were aware of her online postings and her interest in the Islamic State group. I mean, it does feel as though what you're saying there is a kind of deep-seated criticism of detachment in terms of the infrastructure, the state infrastructure in this country.
For all of the resources and energy devoted to safeguarding young children, I think we saw in the cases of these young girls that failed quite catastrophically. I think it was developed much more aggressively after this happened. Now we have a whole sort of superstructure that infiltrates many institutions of state life here, from the NHS to schools all the way down to primary level. You know, my children's school has a prevent booklet, at the front office. But despite all of that, despite it being firmly in place at the time, it failed. And it failed in such a stunning way, I think, that many in the community felt it to be deliberate. How could you not tell a girl's friends that one of their best friends has gone to join ISIS in Syria? At the same time, I do think that for the teachers, kind of teaching these kids and hearing these sorts of things, perhaps also, though, I write about the play. There was a play that was commissioned by the National Youth Theatre about homegrown radicalization. Why do British young people radicalize? And this play was set in East London. It was meant to be performed at Bethnal Green Academy, and it was an all-student cast, and the script was breathtaking, but the degree to which ISIS had become part of young people's vernacular. It was part of their jokes in a quite macabre way. It was part of their ribbing of each other. It was part of bullying. I mean, it was just infused everything. And the degree to which it seemed natural for young kids to invoke ISIS, I think, ended up being so disturbing that play was essentially censored and not allowed to be performed. But I think it was perhaps for some of the teachers something that had become part of the fabric of their students' daily life. So I think on a certain level, and I think that's reflective of a hard discussion that it was just deemed too hard to have by authorities, by the school. Why is it that young people sympathize with the executioner? Why? Why do they sympathize with some part of him? It was not possible to discuss that. But it was also, I think, kind of infusing the atmosphere in ways that at the level of a teacher, perhaps, who might not have been connected with what else the police knew about that girl, seemed normal in a kind of disturbing way.
A really wonderful part of this book is a sense that you walk away from reading it with a notion that these are characters that you could be reading in a novel. The fact that they are rooted in reality is the thing that makes you sit up and pay attention in a different way to the way that you might if you were reading a novel. But you know, you paint a portrait of these young girls who are Shamima Begum, for instance, who's slightly obsessed with the Kardashians. You know, this girl, Shamina, who is just as happy browsing through, you know, the website for ASOS in order to look for a new outfit, as they all are, you know, willing to go shopping and just sit and drink tea and eat dessert and so on. I mean, it feels as though what you really want to do is to show these girls as the full teenagers that they are. I mean, vulnerable to this terrible death cult, but also typical teenagers.
They were, and teenagers can make terrible decisions. They often make terrible, destructive decisions. Usually they're able to walk back from those, whether they get involved with a violent gang, whether they take substances that they shouldn't, whether they get involved with people that they shouldn't. I think, especially with children attracted to, very radical environmental movements. I mean, we see that, this is a period of young people's life where their politics are being awakened, where they're extremely idealistic. They're ripe to be exploited. And I think with this group of teenagers, though, it was just outside the pale. It was not possible to humanize why they could have made this mistake. And I think this was part of the wider, also, climate of how the media covered ISIS as a problem of such utter evil, something that was such an ideological darkness that none of our tools of understanding politics or fractured societies or post-conflict societies or societies of terrible repression where people found, in the end, sought out violent pathways for some sort of access to politics. We couldn't think about it. The media really didn't leave space to have a different understanding of ISIS. And I think at the level of young people who were caught up and lured by its messaging that was not about, please come join our genocidal death cult, but about other things, the girls then became, like ISIS itself, evil, unknowable, not teenagers, not like any of your little sisters or siblings, who could have spent too much time on their phones and been lured into doing something very wrong.
And let's move away then from the UK girls, because the book, I mean, they're at the heart of it, but their stories are amongst 9 others, and they come from all over the Middle East and also from Europe. So, and there's a Muslim convert in there, Emma, who's also known as Dunya. And I just wonder whether you can just take us back to the impulse was the way in which the Bethnal Green girls were treated and portrayed and so on. But just talk us through your process as a journalist, how you got to meet these girls, and how you constructed in your own mind the way in which you wanted to tell these stories.
So as I was searching for them, and my process kind of unfolded as a search, really, in the end, or at least in its initial stages. I went to southern Turkey, which was their crossing point into Syria, which was almost everybody's crossing point into Syria.
Which extraordinarily is this incredibly, at the time, this porous border, which was not really, looked at all by the Turks.
No, there was a whole period in which it was essentially porous, very open. I mean, if you wanted to be uncharitable, left open. It was very easy to get across, and now, of course, there's a massive concrete wall across much of it. But at the time, when the Syrian civil war became a proxy conflict, there was many forces and many countries and many reasons to allow that crossing back and forth to happen. So I traveled to southern Turkey to see if I could meet anyone who had seen these girls and who could tell me how they had crossed or what had happened. And there was, I met a small, I think there was a small community by then, a bigger community of Syrians, but a very, very tiny community, and it was hard to find them. But young women who had come from Raqqa and who had been living in the city when ISIS took it over, who had ended up collaborating for a time. I mean, many families did not leave Syria. Many did, and I think we know that story primarily through the stories of those who left. But those who stayed, sometimes because they couldn't leave because it was prohibitively expensive, or because for some people just leaving is impossible, I think. And so these were young women who were living in Raqqa and who had stayed and who had collaborated and worked with ISIS for a time. Their families did as well. I think they were essentially forced into doing so. I mean, ISIS was, when it took over the town, it was the power in town. It was, if you can imagine, a mafia's control over an area. I mean, everything that you do, your safety, your security, is beholden to this force. And so I spent time with them, kind of trying to understand and trying to see, how were young women from Europe taken into Raqqa? But I was utterly astonished by their own stories. Two of them had been studying at university. One of them was studying English literature. She read novels by Dan Brown. They talked about Agatha Christie. They were all on Facebook. They listened to the same music that I listened to. One of them studied marketing, and she had all these ideas about a career in tourism. I mean, they were worldly girls who were attending university, who I think would have had more independence than any generation of women behind them until the war kind of exploded their lives. And this idea that women could very often just be coerced or out of survival, end up, or making a pragmatic decision about their own security, end up working with this group, and in the course of it doing terrible things. I mean, one of them told me she had worked with the morality police, and she had ended up, having to be in the room when one of her neighbors was brought in for wearing the wrong thing, and the neighbor had to be whipped for this. And that moment where, neighbor and neighbor faced off, and one had joined and one hadn't, and there was this terrible look of betrayal. But all of their stories, they were not, they were not ideological devotees. They were not brainwashed. They didn't believe in the apocalyptic vision. They were just young women who were not unlike women that you or I would know, whose lives had been caught up in this. And then I thought, well, surely then there must be, this idea that the story of ISIS and women was in part a story, society to society, of women who were caught up in a moment and were facing an array of choices that impacted their security or their future, and made a choice that at that moment seemed to make sense for them. And then it kind of built from there. I grew curious about Tunisia because so many women had come from Tunisia. And one of the Syrian young women from Raqqa told me she had never gone to school, and she had really appreciated the religious training that ISIS offered her, because she said, no one had really educated me before, and I really enjoyed someone sitting down with me and teaching me things about my religion. And they had taught her things that she then used to then see and critique ISIS. She said, well, but they had taught me that if you're going to stone a woman, then you have to have this process, and you have to go through this. And she was quite literal about it, but she had gone
She saw
through,
it as an education.
she saw it as an education, and it kind of quite perversely gave her the tools to see that it was really a cruel, barbaric project, and there was no law about it, and there was no religion about it at all. So even though I think she would have quite liked to see religion and politics in Syria, she didn't want to see it in this terrible, quite cruel incarnation, and chose to leave all her family, leave on her own, they all left with nothing but their handbags because they couldn't be a part of it anymore.
But let's talk about Tunis in a little more detail, because it is interesting, isn't it, the contrast between the place where the Arab Spring started and a place where, when you look back at that period now, for all its faults, it produced the most stable outcome politically, if you like, from those revolutions. And yet it is also the country that has drawn the largest number of recruits for the Islamic State group. So because the book isn't just about these 13 women, it draws on your 20 years of experience as a foreign correspondent covering the Middle East. Just talk us through the analysis of that contradiction, if you like.
So, to me, understanding how ISIS could have appealed so considerably to women kind of requires understanding how the Arab Spring played out, because I think we cannot understand it as a separate story. I think it occurs on a continuum. So if we go back to 2011, and if we remember all of those images, country to country, once the Arab revolutions or uprisings had kicked off, women were very much at the forefront of many of those protests. You remember the images of them in Tahrir Square, country to country, from Tunis to Yemen to Syria. These were uprisings in which women were vibrant, they were active, they were at the forefront. They clearly, expected and wished for a voice in whatever was happening, a role in whatever was happening. It was incredible energy, and Tunis amongst them. But I think, just to kind of bookmark this thought. We saw that country to country, many of those protests did not lead to hopeful or positive outcomes. In many, they descended into civil war or greater repression. And a lot of those hopes, country to country, were stifled. But it was a moment in which, I think what grew out, what became ISIS, it was quite evident to see country to country that there was a generation of young women whose political energy and potential had been untapped and was ready and was kind of effervescent and at the surface. So going back to Tunis, I started the book with a young woman called Noor. The book opens with her when she's 13 years old, and this is before the Tunisian Revolution. The government that ruled Tunisia before 2011 was highly repressive. It's kind of called a secular dictatorship. That's a bit, perhaps it's best to say that it was a very authoritarian government that micro-policed people's piety. And there was very little space for organized religion. There was no space for organized religion in political life, and indeed, politics controlled religious life. So visible displays of piety were also, in many cases, illegal. You couldn't wear a headscarf and go to university. You couldn't wear a headscarf and have a government job, and this was a country in which having a government job was, for many people, a kind of ticket to a decent life. So Noor, in this kind of pre-revolution Tunisia, which is so highly controlled, comes from, like many Tunisians, a very religious, traditional family, has been watching YouTube. She's been looking for some religious instruction. She, like many young people, I think, viewed the formal imams as government employees. She didn't really think that they were very authentic or legitimate. So she was looking for her instruction elsewhere, and she read or heard that she had to cover her face. And being a rebellious and religious 13-year-old, she thought, it is my time to start covering myself properly. So she goes to school one day wearing not only just a headscarf, but a face veil. And this is quite an aggressive thing to do in a Tunisia where you can't even wear a simple headscarf to attend school. So she goes into her high school class wearing this, and the first teacher says, you're going to have a terrible day, but I leave you to it. She goes from class to class. One teacher shouts at her, demands that she takes it off, tries to rip it off her head. The next class, the teacher actually hits her. There's like a huge fracas at the school. She's sent home. She's suspended for 10 days. She's told that if she comes back, she can't cover her hair even, let alone her face. And in the end, she decides to drop out of school because she felt that she was choosing between her religion and an education. And for her, it was not even a choice. She would do, what God expected of her. And she dropped out. And stayed at home and kind of was living out an adolescence of very little horizon, when in 2011, this incredible protest kind of sparked, and the whole country kind of revolted. And in the kind of freewheeling aftermath, of course, the sclerotic dictatorship was overthrown. There was a kind of spring in politics. And one of the reasons, and you say, how could it be then that this one experiment, this one Arab Spring country that didn't fall into terrible chaos and repression, that didn't become a civil war, how to understand, how so many young people chose to go from there, the place that was a success. Some people would say that it was that exact freedom that allowed the flourishing of these ideas and these networks to enable young people to go, that perhaps if other countries were freer, there might have been more. But to follow the specific case of Noor got involved in a Salafi youth movement that was very involved in charity. They did a lot of charity work across the country, activists kind of petitioning to be able to go into university wearing that niqab that got Noor so kind of ostracized from school in the first place. And there was a moment, without getting too much into the details of this Tunisian political story, that whole movement, which really spanned a spectrum. There were parts of it that were really quite radical, that expected quite rapid change from the new forces that were in power in Tunisia, that wanted more radical economic change, that wanted more space for religion in public life. And there was a fringe of it that was violent, that was kind of swirled within this, were kind of veterans of the Afghan jihad and the Iraqi Sunni rebellions. And there were those who were the ideologues, who had kind of ideas of a transnational movement that could get all connected together. But then there were Noor and people from the neighborhood who really saw a local story for themselves in this post-revolutionary moment, and saw that it was a correction, that finally there was a space for them in this Tunisian society. But this crackdown that came, and part of it was in response to a couple of political assassinations that were very destabilizing. The whole thing was cracked down upon, and so the whole organization that she was involved in was banned. There was no kind of political wing, violent wing, charitable wing. The whole thing was shut down. And for many young women, and Noor amongst them, it felt as though the experiment was over, that there was no space for a really radical expectation of what space there could be for religion in political life in Tunisia. And one person expressed it to me like this, you just shut down an entire factory. What are they going to do? So some people went back home and said, okay, it was not our time. And some became quite ripe for recruitment by that more radical wing that I talked about, who could then turn around and say, see, we told you there was not going to be space for you after all. You had to lose your, the moderate Islam that they promised you meant no Islam for you in politics. And if you really want to have that vision that you were hoping, you can have it in Syria. And there were very active recruitment networks, and they got commission per head, and they very, very, I think, cunningly reached out to young women like Noor, who had wanted to be able to access public life and work in public and be educated, but still being very conservative, wearing quite conservative clothing. Noor married someone who was caught up in this more kind of extreme part of what I'm talking about, and he went to Syria, and she felt that was the only thing for her to do too. And the promise was, look, we're building a utopian Islamic State. You can come, and there you can be religious, and you can practice your craft and bring whatever skill that you have, and it will be a state for Muslims, because it was not here.
Let's talk a little bit about the pull factor of creating a utopia. There were different methods in which the Islamic State group did this and continues to do it. in the light of the death of al-Baghdadi, I mean, today, and I was presenting today, and we interviewed someone who talked about what next for the group, given the charismatic leadership of this man. I mean, there were people who went specifically because they were responding to his call for creating this state. But in the context of the women who went, just outline for us what the lure was beyond being engaged as political citizens, because there were lots of things that were presented to them as carrots.
There certainly were many promises made. I met in Syria a family of Indonesians who had been led there by the youngest member of the family, who was a millennial, who had been spending a lot of time on her phone, as millennials do, in 2013, 14, I think, and she had stumbled across the blog of a very prominent English language blog of an ISIS recruiter, and there she had read a promise that you could be a full-fledged citizen, you could get health insurance, you could get help with housing. It seemed like the offer of a state where you could go and be a citizen and can contribute your citizenship and in exchange get services. So she had persuaded her whole extended family of 22 to move, because her father had been in debt, and I think an uncle was in debt, and things were difficult for them in Indonesia. And she thought that, reading the kind of marketing stuff in the propaganda, that if they moved there, they would be taken care of. And so they flew there, a family of 22, and kind of said, well, we're ready for our housing, we're ready for our health insurance, and realized quite quickly that the men were expected to fight and the women were expected to marry fighters, and that it was a war front, and that they were expected to fight and be part of the war effort. And they stayed home and resisted, and she wrote letters, and in the end, I think they lost two of the men, and they made it out in the end, but they had gone because they expected that they could be citizens.
Talk us through the distinctions between those blog posts that were used as recruiting tools in English as compared with the ones in Arabic, because they were quite different.
They certainly were. I think in English it was very much reflecting the anxieties and the politics and the identity woes of, I would say, even specifically European young Muslims. So there was a lot of references to racism and Islamophobia, and they don't believe you're feminist if you wear a headscarf. They don't treat you like a feminist. They won't allow you to be. It was very much kind of catered to the geostrategic, political kind of preoccupations of European Western Muslims. Guantanamo and all of these kind of grievances that we know all about. In Arabic, it was again kind of very much bespoke country to country. In Tunisia, there was a lot, as I was talking through Noor's story, about the barriers to any kind of acceptance of women who wore the face veil. Very much kind of, I think, trying to poach on that young radical generation who I think sympathized in the early stages with the Syrian jihad. I mean, I think there was a time in 2013, 2014 when it was broadly seen as sympathetic, and young people thought that they were going to help Muslims who were being slaughtered. There was a lot of messaging and thematics around women's defiled honor. Women are being raped in the prisons of the Assad government, and you must come to their aid. So, speaking to women through, the theme of something that they could relate to. And then a lot to do simply, I mean, in Arabic primarily, there was one Saudi mother and daughter that were very prominent. The daughter became known as kind of the jihadi poetess, and she was very popular, and I think ended up marrying a German or an Austrian who had come over. But it was in Arabic, and particularly around these two very prominent women, it was much more ideological, I would say, the kind of messianic vision and the idea and the idea that there would be a final apocalyptic battle, and some of those things that we know were part of the whole kind of political mythology and eschatology of it.
And I wonder, given everything that you've learned through the stories of these women that you chronicle, how much you have thought. I mean, you've written about it in the book a little bit, but I want you just to reflect a little bit more here. How much you have thought about the way in which policymakers and countries, states, have constructed their counter-terrorism policies and their prevent in this country, the counter-narrative to the lure of the Islamic State group. I mean, to what extent do you think they have utterly misunderstood the appeal of this group for young women, in particular, that they really haven't been able to construct a counter-narrative that would persuade them not to join?
I'm going to say one more thing in response to your last question, and then I will come to counter-narratives, because I think I should have shaded the question about what appears in the kind of two worlds of the messaging, to kind of emphasize that, especially I think in Arabic, the idea that women were being offered membership, I think, is really important, because it was made explicit finally. I think ISIS was the first transnational, you can call them jihadist or militant group, that offered women direct membership. It said, you can come be of us. You don't have to come.
And equal.
And equal. And, well, I don't know if it promised equal, but it said that...
Or maybe they believed it was going to be equal.
I think they did. And so there was lots of back and forth saying, well, is it true that we too can go and, have military training? Or is it true? And there was lots of questions where women who were seeking it out wanted to know exactly how much genuine influence they could have. But it was really the first time that a militant group had offered women a kind of role in their own right. And we saw that they did take up roles that were quite operationally, in terms of recruitment, messaging, administrative functions, more. I mean, the al-Qaedas of the past had never offered this. Women were just meant to be wives. They could raise the next generation of believers and fighters, but they were very clearly at the margin. And I think that ISIS, having seen this force, this kind of upswelling of women's engagement and political participation in the Arab Spring, realized that this would be a really fertile ground. And it was a moment to offer women more. And it had kind of in its own way a gender strategy, which is, I think, quite striking and kind of reflects that a lot of states in particular didn't have answers for some of those expectations and frustrations that women had. On the messaging and on the counter-messaging, despite, I think, vast amounts of money and time and consultants and elaborate kind of hashtag schemes to kind of develop counter-messages to ISIS, I think...
Animated films as well.
Animated films, graphic novels, anything you can imagine. I think any entertainment product has been secretly, usually, kind of produced and kind of commissioned to have a counter-narrative message, country to country even. I think this operated alongside what states were really doing. I think the way to counter the appeal of ISIS was simply to dehumanize ISIS and make ISIS evil and to splash, photos of the executioners everywhere. I mean, perhaps that was really the effective counter-messaging. The messaging that was put forward, and we see so much of this was kind of, I think part of the trouble with this is much of this counter-messaging is essentially paid for by the government, but it is cast in and kind of funneled through, seeming to make it look like grassroots, women's organizations or neighborhood associations coming around to do this. But it ends up really, in the end, coming out to be a government message. I mean, I am not one who really believes in radicalization theory, so I also don't buy in terribly much to, the idea of counter-messaging. I mean, I see the roots of these kind of conflicts in wars, in wars that have emerged from, terrible and disastrous policies like the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the terrible aftermath of that followed, and also in the specific histories of Syria and this kind of uniquely authoritarian, totalitarian regime that offered absolutely, no space. It was crushing in quite singular ways. And so this is, the cause of militancy. And in the end, we look at the number of Muslims in this country, 5 million. How many in France? How many young people actually did buy into this message that we believe that these 5 million Muslims in this country require counter-messaging, on that level? It's something like 800 people. So in the end, I understand it as a policing problem. I think that counter-messaging is a tool of policing, and I think someone said it quite well. It leaves the Home Office to clean up a problem created by the Foreign Office, which I think is apt. And if you're obliged as a policeman to keep people safe, perhaps this is what you do. You reach for these tools and you attempt to do it, and it feels quite saccharine, and many people are probably turned off by it. But then perhaps, there are spaces. But I think the real failures around counter-messaging, which comes alongside this idea of let's protect vulnerable people from these bad messages, is the institutions and the structures that would protect young people from bad messages are increasingly absent because we don't pay for them anymore, because we have an austerity budget. And so community centers and after-school clubs and all these other sorts of kind of things that we would pay for and enable communities to have where young people could go, if they do exist, they're paid for by counter-terrorism funding, and they're often used for surveillance, which makes young people and families ambivalent about using them. So the whole kind of world of counter-messaging is so, I think, enswirled with the kind of surveillance of Muslim civil society and the channeling of anything that you could do that would be a positive benefit to vulnerable young people, whether you should just offer it on its own right, is now being offered with the aim of ensuring that people don't become extremists, which of course I think essentially kind of pollutes the relationship so much that the effort doesn't even meet the effort that it was intended to be, whether that's a community center because no one goes, or whether it's a youth leadership association that then families find out is actually kind of funded by Prevent. So I think the whole thing is a complete disaster.
Let's talk about the legacy of the fall of ISIS in terms of the swathe of territory that they commanded for a considerable time. The fallout has been these camps. And when you talk about vulnerable people, we are now talking about tens of thousands of women and children who are in these camps. And I wonder what your reflections are, given the writing of this book, about those camps, how the world is dealing with those women and children, but also the extent to which they too remain breeding grounds for a particular way of radical thinking.
These camps that exist, they're dotted across the northeast of Syria and a part of Syria that's not controlled by the Syrian government, but that was until about 2 weeks ago when Turkey entered that north of the country that was under the control of the US-led coalition. So these camps were sort of centers where women, foreign women and children who had joined ISIS or who had born children there are detained. One of them has fallen in the aftermath of the Turkish incursion, so there's now 2 left. But they are essentially massive detention centers full of children. We're talking about over 13,000 women and children, largely in one camp. Over 60% of them are just children under the age of 12, and they are from 54 different nationalities. A third of them are Western, so mainly European governments. So if you can think about that, a third of 13,000 are Western European women and children who are living in essentially detention, but in terrible, absolutely deplorable conditions. The water supply is rife with disease. There's malnourishment. Many of them were injured in the final battle with ISIS, so they have shrapnel embedded in their bodies. They are really the kind of the human fallout of this conflict. But it's, I think, quite urgent because there's no plan for what to do with them. European governments don't want to take them back. They are, I think, feel emboldened in this position that's quite irresponsible by public sentiment in Europe. And partly one can understand, doesn't feel that these are a particularly sympathetic group of women. They think, well, they left, they turned their back on the West, they didn't want to be British citizens anymore, let them suffer their fate. And I think from France to Germany to Belgium to Holland, that is the attitude. And governments that are primarily deciding what to do based on quite short-term political calculations, very worried that if they do repatriate all of these women and children, if there is kind of even one attack in one country perpetrated by someone they brought back, then that's certain electoral defeat for them. And of course there is far-right nationalist forces at work or movements underway in all of these countries that are kind of primed to put a finger on precisely this. So we're really in an absolutely terrible quandary, and the Turkish incursion into the north has kind of added to the chaos of what should be done. But really, in the end, I think it's quite an incredible situation where really legally, especially the children, country to country, European governments very often going against their own courts that are ruling in favor of repatriating children are refusing to do the legal and perhaps moral thing, but also probably the more secure thing, because ultimately, what is to be done with these people if they are left there abandoned on the margins of some kind of semi-functional Syria, left in these camps where there are really a core of hardcore ISIS women still very active, who burn down the tents of other women, who stab the Kurdish guards who are guarding them, who even just the week before the Turkish incursion, this particular camp that I'm talking about, the large one called Al-Hol, was at breaking point because there had been women who had managed to smuggle guns into the camp, and there was a shootout with the Kurdish forces. 4 women were shot. So MSF was, instead of tending these malnourished babies, had to start, tending these women with gunshot wounds. And 2 women were murdered as well because they had been sentenced to apostasy in these makeshift kind of religious courts that women had set up. So there's a core of very, very violent women in these camps, and all of these young European children are being kept in there, penned in amongst them, simply because no one has a plan. There's no plan for what to do, and it is a kind of unprecedented problem. Of course, country to country, there's difficulty assessing what women have done, whether they have been involved in crimes or have not. How do we hold them accountable? What do you do with a woman who may have been part of a recruitment network, but then she herself might have been sexually abused and suffered very much at the hands of ISIS? So she is guilty of some criminal activity. She is also a victim. I mean, the incredible kind of diversity and nuance of this population of women, I think, is just kind of overwhelming, and governments don't know what to do. And I think publics are very much caught up in this cycle of revulsion. They see the image of Shamima Begum, that journalists kind of splashed on the front page, and the idea that someone like her could be seen as so dangerous, and whatever risk calculation is applied to these women, that she could have been the most dangerous. A young girl who was recruited at 15, had 3 children by the time she was 19, all 3 of whom died, and that she, amongst them all, is so dangerous as to be deprived of her citizenship. But I think there's also something, and I'm straying now a little bit from the problem of the camps, which I think will endure and is a kind of shared Western problem. There's something very disturbing to me about the particular kind of racist-tinged misogyny that has kind of embodied itself or streamed into the case of Shamima Begum. Because I think about even the executioner, Jihadi John, and he was just frightening. he was the face of terror, right? He was the face of evil holding the knife, and he was just scary. But Shamima Begum has become despicable. You know, she has become something even worse. She's become a racist epitaph. I mean, it's something that women who are with headscarves are called on the street now. So the particular way that a woman who has been involved in this kind of violence becomes such the target of extreme hate is perplexing to me, even more so than the executioner himself.
We've come full circle now since you've brought up Shamima, and I've got one more question before I open it up to the floor. Your impulse for writing the book, you've articulated so well, and I just wonder to what extent you feel a little bit transformed, both as a journalist and as a person having met these women, because it's quite clear that you want to present a much more nuanced portrait of the different reasons why young women are drawn to this group. But I wonder if you would reflect on how it's changed you as a journalist, as a person.
I think as a journalist, it's made me much more conscious, I think, of the way that I think about or police my emotional borders with people. I think I met a lot of women who had received no empathy at all. And I think that in the course of talking to them and understanding what happened to them, I perhaps, at moments I felt that I had to be very careful not to compensate for that by being too empathetic. And that's not something I've ever encountered before. I mean, I've reported on many difficult places and talked to women who've, had their children killed at, checkpoints in Iraq. And, I've worked on many, many painful and difficult stories. But many of the women who I met in the course of this were extraordinarily complex, and they were very intelligent, and they had a very strong sense of how they could deploy their stories for good effect. So I think kind of excavating of my own emotional reactions to sources, which is something that, one would think, I had spent my career doing, but I had never had to do it, at this level of intensity before. And I think I would also say perhaps as a person, as a journalist as well, having to think carefully and go through some sort of process of understanding how I, as a very secular person by background, can relate to and think about people who are very religious. I think that's a real gap in much of the journalism in the Middle East that we do, because overwhelmingly, usually, Western correspondents have barriers of language and nationality that they have to work across, but we also have barriers of religiousness to work across. And how do I understand and absorb and think about the motivations and thinking and perceptions of someone who is experiencing political upheaval and making decisions that seem rational and that are rational, but that are imbued with a level of faith, and how to assess that without essentializing the faith or blaming it, or how do I even begin to assess it for them when it's such a incredibly intricate and sometimes even unknowable process internally. And I think it was for me very humbling to try and to accept my limitations as someone who is very secular, and to perhaps be a little bit less secular as I try to understand people who were not at all.
Thank you for your honesty. We're going to open it up to the floor. I think there is a microphone. Hand gone up there straight away, and one at the back. So let's go here first.
You mentioned the problem as unparalleled, and I'm sure it is in many ways. Are there any lessons from previous episodes of rehabilitating the perpetrators and accessories to fascism in China, Cambodia, Indonesia, Germany, if you go a long way back, many of whom were teenagers when they were, the guy who's being tried in Germany right now was 16, 17 when he was a guard. Are there any lessons from those experiences which we've now seen play out over decades that we can apply to this, or is it just too different?
Thank you. That's such a important question, and I should caveat. I mean, I think it's certainly unparalleled. I think it's unparalleled for governments' legal and security regimes, because they simply don't know what to do with someone who went and joined ISIS and genuinely didn't really do much but stay at home and has come back. I mean, should that person get 5 years in prison, 1 year in prison, 10 years in prison? So unprecedented kind of in that way. But in terms of our experiences globally, having dealt with many conflicts in which children were recruited as soldiers, were forced to hurt their families, experiences of other conflicts where women who joined a militant group and who've come out of it have to be rehabilitated. I think we have a real kind of plethora of experience, and aid agencies certainly do. I mean, we have Rwanda, we have Cambodia, we have Nigeria. We know exactly what to do when we have to take people back out of having had to perpetrate terrible evil. We know how to kind of support them. We know how to work with the community and give the community a sense that it has a choice in taking people back, because we've come to understand conflict after conflict that there are two sides, and it's not simply rehabilitating those involved in the conflict, but giving the community that has to accept those people back that hurt it a stake in and a voice in that process. So I think we really do, and I think we're getting to a point where policymakers, UN people, who are involved in this process, country to country, are seeking to do exactly this, to say that we've done this before, we know how to do it, we can draw upon all of our practices, and we should stop acting like and talking about it as though it's not something we know how to do.
Isn't there a fundamental problem here as well when you think about the core of the grievances? There has to be an acknowledgement on the part of the West. If the grievances are connected to foreign policies conducted by Western governments, and there is no acknowledgement on the part of Western governments that that could be a reason that would propel these women in that direction. In fact, what you hear all the time is Western governments saying they hate our way of life. And it's always that's the rhetoric. And I wonder about that, the lack of that acknowledgement, and what that does to the hardening of the ideology, which could result in, really no rehabilitation ever, not real, true rehabilitation.
Well, it sort of takes me to why I think it's really interesting that many former militants are often not brought out. Why are we not exposed to women who came back from ISIS writing their own books, or why are they not youth mentors, or why are they not on the stage at the National Youth Theatre? I think it's precisely because they will come back and say ISIS was barbaric and cruel and wicked, and I regret it deeply. However, the reasons I went there because I was upset with UK foreign policy and the Assad torture prisons and all of these things, I still believe in all of that. And so the messaging is not really welcome, I think. I think that the acknowledgement of grievances ultimately has to go hand in hand with a willingness to do foreign policy differently, which is why I think the specter of a Labour government is quite terrifying, because it might actually do some foreign policy differently. But up until now, I think there's been no willingness to countenance doing anything different abroad, just a preparedness to do counterinsurgency at home to deal with the effects of that.
Hand right at the back, and then we'll go here at the front.
Thank you very much. I arrived about 10 minutes late, so you may have touched upon this before my arrival, but let me say what it is. Throughout the hour or so I've been here, I really was waiting for something to be said about the power of an idea, how seductive that idea is to many people, not just European Muslims, but Muslims all over the world, and that is the building blocks of political Islam that turned a religion into a political ideology. The idea that Islam is the solution, Islam is superior, Islam makes you better than other people, and this is a prelude to dehumanizing the other, and you go down the route of basically preparing, given the right type of psychology, someone to kill someone else. And that is a debate about Islamism and violence in the Middle East, where I come from. And I often miss this in a discussion of radicalization in Western societies, that I just wanted to know whether you may touch upon this in your book. I haven't read the book yet, or share your thoughts about that with us. Thank you.
I think it's quite a broad question. I mean, does political Islam in its most extreme form in some countries and places under some particular movements involve an othering of the opponent that can be conducive to dehumanizing? I would say quite abstractly yes, and I think this is where we go down the... I think it's a dead end. Is Salafi Islam the cause of, a lot of this militancy that ends up being nihilistic, that ends up dehumanizing the other? I mean, I don't subscribe to that. I mean, I don't think that political Islam operates on a continuum with like Salafi Wahhabism over here and Ikhwan over here, and that as you move down this way, you are bound to dehumanize the other and have a terrible, toxic politics in your midst. I think that that's by and large too abstract and too crude. I think that there are aspects of Salafism that lend themselves to like the deep sectarianism that took root in Iraq and Syria, but I think it's very rooted in the politics and the disempowerment of Sunnis in those two countries in the aftermath of the war. So I mean, of course, I think that there are ways that you can look at. I think there's a whole... Look, I'll say that there's a whole religious backstory to this question, and I don't write about this because I'm not a religious scholar, and I'm not the one to write that book. I think you could write a whole book about the decline of mainstream, what does that mean? The decline of traditional centers of Islamic thought that are
moderate
not
is
moderate.
The word that people like to use.
Moderate Islamic thought, and alongside that, the empowerment, the growth of a very reactionary, black and white form of Salafism that has been part of this story. But I don't arrive at that as an answer, really. I mean, I think that we can understand the rise of ISIS, looking at a panorama of political, economical, and social contemporary histories, and that is a strand of it. But I don't think we can separate it out and say that, that is what happens when you give political Islam a free rein, because I think we see, many different movements, eras, areas where that has not been the case. And, I think arguably political Islam has not been given a chance anywhere. I mean, look at Tunisia. It has been squashed. The moderate, peaceful Islamists of Tunisia are arguably no longer even Islamists in order to participate in politics. So I think if there was space for actually genuine moderate political Islam, it would really be a stabilizing force. But I don't think that the political economy of the Middle East of the last 50 years has allowed that. So that's my thoughts on that.
Your hand went up here, and then...
Sorry, down the front there.
Yeah, just in the front, and then we'll go over here, please.
I wanted to return to a different type of legitimate grievance. So when we talk about recruitment, often the focus is on the predatory tactics of the recruiting force and the sophistication of their methods and the idea that people aren't educated enough to resist these particular processes, rather than having any acknowledgement of the kernels of legitimate grievance that lie at their vulnerability. Some of those might be around foreign policy, but you also mentioned that there are domestic ones about the disaffection of the Muslim community in the UK, the undeniable rise in Islamophobia over the past few years, its mainstreaming in political discourse, and that the responses from government have been very transactional and very much like, we're just trying to prevent you from becoming extremist, rather than recognizing those grievances and sort of airing them in a constructive way. So I was wondering if you were giving advice to the government, what do you think would be seen as credible and authentic platforms for Muslim communities across the UK to air those grievances and sort of talk about them in a candid and sober way rather than ignoring them?
I think you could start very easily with the removal of barriers. I mean, I think right now we're in an era of unprecedented barriers and securitization of many discourses. I mean, if you are an activist who espouses BDS, you will potentially fall afoul of your university. You may come under the radar of security services. I mean, arguably, that is not something that should be highly securitized when you have a community who largely, I think, feels tremendous sympathy for that particular movement and cause.
So just to explain to those who don't know, this is about divestment in Israel. And boycotting Israel.
The prevent safeguarding, which means that at universities, there's a whole host of speakers. I think there's a whole sort of swath of Muslim Britain that can no longer give talks anywhere because they're deemed extremists, because some of their social views are considered extreme because they are, if those views were espoused by someone of another religion, they would just be deemed socially conservative. But in a Muslim, they are extremists. So I think we have a whole kind of regime of censorship at the level of universities, the level where young people really want to be hearing vibrant, active, and politically relevant things. It's very, very challenging. I mean, I tried to have a talk at the university where I used to teach to have someone from CAGE. The organization CAGE are like public pariahs in this country. I had student groups when I went and I canvassed my Muslim student group, who do you want to hear from? And they said, well, we'd really like to hear from Muazzam Beg. So I said, okay, I will try and go invite him here for a talk. And 2 weeks of my life was dedicated to paperwork. I had to email the lawyers, and we had to have, the police come and check the room. And it was an administrative punishment for me, essentially, by the university to have attempted to have this speaker. So, I mean, these are simply barriers. I mean, I think we can talk about, a whole host of other things that can be done positively behind that, but just removing the intense kind of the stigma or all-out kind of blocking of a whole kind of range of subjects and speakers and organizations, and they're also kind of constantly attacked by the media. They're attacked by the Blair Institute that seems to be working in tandem with the media at some times.
But do you think that this is all entirely informed then by the responses to actual terrorist activity in this country? Because if the media is then dominated by a perception and one that's correct, if you see the number of people who've been killed, say in Manchester or in the 7/7 bombings and so on, these are real things that have really happened. People have been killed as a result of the ideology espoused by people who I'm not saying they're comparable to the people that you're talking about who are coming and wanting to have platforms at various academic institutions, but I'm talking about the thing that informs people's caution, their inability to see that actually dialogue is better than no dialogue. It's something that's very viscerally felt. I suppose that's what I'm saying. I mean, only to do that BBC thing of putting the other side.
I mean, sometimes I do think, what if I was a counter-terrorism police commissioner and my job was to keep people safe? Like, what would I do? I mean, I can quite see that maybe that's what you would do. People have been killed. Many people have been killed. And as police counter-terrorism commissioner, I don't get to tell the Foreign Office what to do in the Middle East. They do that. I'm just trying to keep people safe. And if these kinds of activities, these political preoccupations, these geostrategic activities, I mean, if all of this is kind of seen as a gateway, Syria aid and Syria charities were said very explicitly, were seen as a gateway to extremism. in certain ways, you could see that there would be a pathway of going from this charity to maybe, hanging around in Idlib and maybe checking out, what some of these groups were doing. And it's not out of them. I mean, it's very rational. I mean, I think it's very rational counterinsurgency policing done at home. So it's not at all unfathomable why it's like that. It's just, ultimately, if you're going to have... I think it exposes the limits of a Western liberal democracy to have a multicultural society at home and conduct a foreign policy abroad that elicits these kinds of reactions. I think that's where our tension is.
I'm in humanitarian affairs, and thank you for bringing, talking about the conditions in some of the camps and Al-Hol in particular. Have you looked at, you said some governments don't really know what to do with these people who are classed as detainees. Did you look at international humanitarian law, and has this been a focus of some of your questions and discussions maybe around some of the parcours of some of the women? And as such, how do you think this affects, for example, their prospects, their protection as detainees or as children and protected populations under IHL? And the second, what do you think will ultimately happen to these populations in the camps? With a reminder that Al-Hol, I think, is 2/3 of them are children. Thank you.
Thank you. The question about legal status is such an important one, because if that was clarified, at least these women and children could be given some rights. I mean, you have rights as a displaced person, you have rights as a refugee, you have rights as a prisoner of war. Like, each of these categories comes with certain rights, and these women have no rights of any of these categories. They can't even access medical services, really. And so doing some sort of assessment of where they fall legally and under whose regime they fall as that legal category was so important. And I think that was kind of the next thing that needed to be done. And that I think, many forces were averse to do, because dealing with them and offering them these services and giving them these rights was proving so extraordinarily complex. Because at the same time, the very vulnerable population is being taken care of or attempted to, or detained in an area that's also the center of the ISIS counterinsurgency campaign. So, like, one of the things that should have been done is to kind of separate out these very violent women, but then it's quite easy for them then for ISIS to break them out. So, like, all of the solutions on the humanitarian side seem to then produce problems on the counterterrorism security side. So it was really, a problem, a hellish problem, not to, borrow from that from that book. So I think the legal status is elusive, but at the end, I think because we've seen so many Western governments essentially overrule their court systems, I mean, even, I guess the vulnerability and the precariousness of your legal status is the moral of the story. I mean, you can then be identified as having these rights, but if your home governments are willing to essentially overrule the courts and override the courts and their own laws for the sake of their security concerns, then, how much store can we put in the legal process? And then your second question? What will happen? It's the most depressing. It's really. I really think that most Western governments hope that in whatever kind of chaos happens to this area, many people will be killed. I mean, Rory Stewart said it. He said it. When did he say it? That really, in the best scenarios, these people will be killed. He said it very openly. I think he was talking about the male fighters, but I think, it's kind of what everyone hopes for the women and children too, because that's how they're acting, and you judge people based on their actions. And if you're acting in a way that maroons these people and puts them in keeps them in terrible vulnerability in the middle of a war zone, then you are not acting to keep them safe. I think some, because of public pressure, and really kudos to the BBC for having found those British orphans and put their face all over the news, because I think that kind of broke through the incredibly resistant kind of British position on any kind of repatriation. So I think some children will be repatriated, and maybe that will open the door for some of their mothers coming back too, but it's also possible not to see it happening.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, I'm guessing that you probably didn't, but I'm just asking you, do you mention Saudi Arabia at all in this book? Because the ISIS phenomenon, you know, it's quite, the Saudi connection is one that people, for various reasons, don't talk about too much, but you know, there is this, the ISIS created from this Wahhabism, which Saudi Arabia has propagated everywhere, including in Britain. So the questioner there who talked about Muslims feeling aggrieved and so on, some of that is stimulated and promoted by the Wahhabism, which is paid for and organized from Saudi. I'm just thinking it would be an interesting aspect to this, that they have responsibility in the dreadful things that have happened in these camps, and that they have funded and supported ISIS for a number of years. Anyway.
I wrestle briefly with the Salafism question because it's there, and I think we have to wrestle with it. I think it was phrased really well by the head of the Cambridge School of Theology, Tim Winters, also known as, you know, he's Muslim, he's Abdul Hakim Murad as well. He has a really beautiful piece on Salafism, and he has a term called Salafi burnout, which he describes as a process that a lot of young European Muslims who are exposed to some of these texts that do come from Saudi Arabia, and they do, I think, kind of aspire to this kind of type of extreme orthodoxy, and then they burn out because it's so unreconcilable with the rest of their life. So he kind of describes it as Salafism as like this unstable isotope, which I think is really helpful because it's an unstable isotope, and it has such a propensity for extreme othering that I think we have to identify it as a part of this landscape that we're talking about. However, then the kind of political scientist in me, you know, having worked in northeastern Nigeria, where Boko Haram, which calls itself a Salafi jihadist movement, has succeeded or come to some sort of power and kind of, you know, terrorizes the Northwest. I've worked on Somalia, a country where Al-Shabaab, which is a Salafi jihadist movement, essentially controls much of Somalia. Those movements and those, you know, it's all sort of called Salafi jihadism, but it occurs in places where there is an absolute vacuum of governance or terrible, corrupt, brutal governance, or in the aftermath of, you know, Somalia, an invasion that was deeply unpopular that gave rise to a very fierce nationalist bashklak. So you can see that it certainly, it's unstable and it propels, you know, it's really kind of the perfect ideology for an insurgent movement because it gives you such a vital way of like declaring the other your enemy and a very fulsome kind of set of ways of thinking about that justify what insurgent violence would need to do. But I mean, in the end, it would not grow and reach and ferment in these places if these societies were not so fractured. So it's part of it. And I think, you know, like, is it kind of crazy that the Saudi religious establishment can choose who's the imam at Guj Street Mosque? It's a bit crazy, but I think it happens. Some of these textbooks that have been sent around the world for many years, I don't think, you know, it's done great things for many of the places where they've gone. At the same time, there's been a decline in other strains and creeds of Islam for very political reasons. But I must kind of mix it up and kind of put it on canvas in a charcoal because I think it's there and I think we have to recognize it. But I think it kind of enters into pictures that are already quite fully drawn as well.
We've got time for one final question. Gentleman just there in the middle.
Hi, I'll keep it brief. Firstly, excellent speech, so discussion, thank you. I'm just interested in the decision-making of a 15-year-old girl in East London. And, you know, we talk about political discourse and all these sorts of things in quite complex areas, but, you know, how much would a 15-year-old know? I don't know. I struggled with it doing a master's a few years ago. So is there any argument, and this might be a straight no, for how much did they decide to go because it was a great adventure?
It's certainly present in the book.
I think it was a great adventure, and I think it felt rebellious. I think they rebelled to the right of their parents, and I think that feels really good too. Like, rebelling to the right is like particularly satisfying. I think they had a whole kind of sisterhood dynamic going, and they were doing it together, and it was secret, and it reminded me of like the virgin suicides.
There's a quote from the Jeffrey Kennedy's book in the book, yeah.
So I think that's there. I mean, I think they were, you know, looking at pictures of sunsets and deserts and kind of imagining, you know, this fantasy alternative world in which they would fit, and they would have their sisters there, and they might get married there. And I think it was there, you know, this idea that it was, you know, a secret adventure between them, and no one could breathe a word of it. You know, I think as 14, 15-year-olds, you know, that's what they do. So I think certainly, I mean, the political stuff swirling amongst it is there, and I think resonated as they were kind of starting to understand what injustice meant. But I think this girlhood, sisterhood, adventure, doing something dangerous, getting out of these home environments in which I think all of them also felt quite trapped and unhappy, at least a couple of them. I think that was emotionally, certainly, I think, at the forefront of the experience.
I read an awful lot of fiction, but I also read an awful lot of non-fiction. And I think if there was one book that I would press into your hands for you to read as we approach the end of this year, this is the book that I would press into your hands. So I just want to say thank you to Azadeh, first of all, for a fantastically eloquent expostulation of what your book is about tonight, but also for your book. I think it's very, very important. And I'm really delighted that you've written it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I also happen to believe in the ripple effect of culture, which is something I say at a lot of events that I do. Once you've read the book, tell 5 people. If you agree with me, tell 5 people about the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.